The sky over the Persian plain tears open at dawn. There is no warning, no explanation. One moment, the ancient world exists exactly as it has for centuries. Dust, horses, bronze armor glinting under a rising sun. The next moment, the air itself seems to fracture, and out of that fracture come machines that should not exist for another 2,000 years. Panzer tanks, Diva Bombis, half-tracks loaded with soldiers in gray uniforms who have no idea what has just happened to them. An entire armored division of the German Wehrmacht, pulled directly from the Eastern Front of 1941, materializes in the heart of the Persian Empire in 330 BC. The exact year, the exact season, that Alexander the Great is marching his army deeper into Persian territory after the fall of Persepolis. The German soldiers do not understand what they are looking at. Neither do the Persian scouts who spot the impossible convoy of steel vehicles from a ridgeline 3 miles away and ride for their lives to report it. Within hours, word reaches Alexander's camp. Not an army of demons, iron beasts breathing smoke, moving without horses, faster than anything the ancient world has ever seen. Alexander does not believe the reports until he sees it himself. He rides forward with a cavalry escort to observe from a safe distance, and what he sees defies every category of warfare he has ever studied. Tanks are not creatures. They are built things, machines of iron that move under their own power. He does not know the word for engine, but he understands immediately that this is not magic. It is craft, and anything built by human hands can eventually be understood, and anything understood can eventually be defeated. The German commander, a Wehrmacht colonel whose name history will never record because history itself has just been broken, has the opposite problem. His maps are useless. His radio picks up nothing but static. No command chain, no Berlin, no Eastern Front. His fuel gauges read the same numbers they read an hour ago, but he has no idea where the nearest supply depot might be, or if one even exists in whatever world this now is. The colonel makes the only decision available to him. Establish a defensive perimeter. Send scouts. Figure out where and when his division has ended up. The scouts return with reports that sound like fever dreams. Men in bronze armor, carrying long spears. Vanishes, a language no one recognizes. Architecture that looks like the history books, but wrong somehow. Too new, too intact, columns and temples that should be ruins, standing complete and freshly painted. One young lieutenant, a former history student before the war, puts the pieces together first and says the word out loud, half joking, half terrified. Time travel. Nobody laughs. It is the only explanation that fits the impossible evidence in front of them. Alexander, meanwhile, has already made his decision. He will not attack blind. He orders his companions to hold position and sends Persian-speaking scouts, disguised as local farmers, to observe the German camp from a distance for 3 days. He wants to know how these iron beasts eat, how they sleep, how they move, before he commits a single soldier. What his scouts report back changes everything. The iron beasts stop moving after a certain distance. They sit motionless, and the men inside curse and strike them with tools. Alexander understands the pattern immediately, even without knowing the word fuel. These machines consume something to move, and whatever they consume, they are running out of it. This is the first crack in the German position, and Alexander has found it within 72 hours of first contact. Faster than any modern general facing an unknown army 18 centuries in the past would have managed the same feat in reverse. The colonel, unaware he is being watched this closely, makes a fateful decision of his own. Rather than wait passively for an enemy he cannot identify, he orders a reconnaissance in force. 3 tanks and 2 platoons of infantry, pushing toward the nearest visible concentration of enemy forces to test their capability. It is the worst decision he could have made, though he has no way of knowing it yet. The German patrol advances across open ground exactly as Wehrmacht doctrine trained them to. Tanks leading, infantry following in the cover of the armor, standard procedure against any conventional 20th century enemy. Alexander's forces are not a conventional enemy. They are the most disciplined heavy infantry the ancient world has ever produced, and they do something the German patrol has no training to counter. They simply do not engage in the open field at all. The Macedonian phalanx melts back into the terrain, retreating through olive groves and rocky hillsides that swallow infantry formations whole. The tanks, designed for the open steppes of Russia, struggle immediately on ground littered with boulders and terracing built for agriculture 2,000 years before tank warfare was ever conceived. One panzer throws a track on uneven stone terracing within the first mile. It becomes a stationary pillbox rather than a weapon. Alexander's companion cavalry, the finest heavy cavalry in the ancient world, appears on the German flank exactly where the retreating infantry lured them. It is not a suicidal charge into tank fire. It is a probe, fast riders testing the machine gun range and reaction time of the vehicles, then withdrawing before losses mount. The German machine guns cut down 6 horses and 2 riders in the first exchange. It looks like victory. It is not. Alexander now knows the exact effective range of German firepower, the rate of fire, and how quickly the vehicles can traverse their weapons to track a moving target. He has purchased this knowledge with 8 men, a price he considers acceptable for information that will shape the entire campaign. The patrol returns to the German camp having gained nothing but a stuck tank they must abandon and a supply of fuel that is now measurably lower than when they left. The colonel reviews the encounter and reaches a conclusion that terrifies him more than anything else that has happened since the transition. His enemy is not disorganized tribesmen. Whoever commands the forces opposing him is thinking several steps ahead, testing his capabilities with the patience of a chess player rather than the panic of a primitive army encountering the impossible. 3 days later, the fuel crisis the young lieutenant predicted arrives in full. The division's fuel reserves, calculated for a modern war with modern supply lines, were never designed to last indefinitely. Panzers consume enormous quantities of fuel simply idling, let alone maneuvering across broken terrain, avoiding an enemy who refuses open battle. Half the division's vehicles are now stationary, not destroyed, simply out of fuel, transformed overnight from the most feared weapons in the ancient world into steel monuments that cannot move an inch. The colonel faces a decision no Wehrmacht training manual ever prepared him for. Ammunition remains plentiful. Manpower remains intact. But mobility, the single greatest advantage his division possesses over an ancient army, is evaporating by the hour, and there is no factory, no oil field, no supply convoy anywhere in this impossible world that can replace what has been burned. Alexander's scouts report the German vehicles going silent one by one across the valley floor. He does not yet understand the word fuel, but he understands stillness. And stillness in an enemy that has spent days demonstrating terrifying mobility means something fundamental has changed in his favor. He summons his generals. Parmenion, his most experienced commander, argues for immediate full assault while the iron beasts sit motionless. Alexander disagrees. He has seen what the machine guns did to 8 men in less than a minute. A frontal assault, even against stationary targets, risks catastrophic losses against weapons his army has no answer for at close range. Instead, Alexander orders something that will define the rest of this campaign. A siege, not a battle. Surround the German position. Cut off any possibility of foraging, scouting, or repositioning. Let the same resource starvation that has crippled half their vehicles now work against every soldier trapped inside that perimeter. The German colonel watches Macedonian forces begin encircling his position from a ridge 2 miles out, moving with a coordination that no primitive force should possess, and understands with growing dread that whoever leads the army opposing him has correctly diagnosed his single greatest weakness and is now exploiting it with textbook precision. A precision that, if he is being honest with himself, exceeds anything he studied in his own military academy. Neither side has fired a decisive shot. Neither side has lost more than a handful of men. But as the sun sets on the 4th day, since 2 armies separated by 2,000 years found themselves sharing the same battlefield, it is already clear that this war will not be won by whoever has better weapons. It will be won by whoever can survive longer without them. What happens when Alexander's siege tightens and the German division runs completely dry? Drop your prediction below. Part 2 is coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Day 7 of the siege, and the German position has changed from an army to a fortress with a fixed expiration date. The last drop of usable fuel burned 4 days ago, spent on a final desperate attempt to reposition 2 tanks into better defensive angles. Every panzer in the division now sits exactly where it ran dry, some at odd angles on hillsides, one half submerged in a dry creek bed where its driver tried to find one last route to escape the tightening circle. Colonel Hoffmann. History has finally recorded his name. Carved by necessity into the radio logs, his signals officer keeps out of habit, even though no signal has ever been received, has stopped thinking of his division as an armored force. It no longer is one. What remains is 600 infantrymen, functioning machine guns with limited ammunition, and a perimeter that is held for a week against an enemy who refuses to make the mistake of attacking it directly. Alexander has not ordered a single frontal assault since the first contact. His generals, particularly Parmenion, have pushed for it repeatedly. Alexander's answer has been the same each time. Machine guns make a frontal assault a massacre of his own men, and he has never spent Macedonian lives on a battle he can win by patience instead. So he has not attacked. He has surrounded and waited and studied. What Alexander's scouts have identified, after a week of careful observation, is the German position's single greatest vulnerability. Not the machine guns, not the remaining ammunition stockpile, but modest natural spring at the eastern edge of the German perimeter, the only reliable water source within miles. Cut the spring, and 600 men in the Persian heat have days, not weeks. Alexander gives the order on the morning of day 8. A detachment of his most disciplined infantry, supported by cavalry screening the flanks, moves to seize the high ground directly above the spring, not to attack the German perimeter, but to control the water source from outside it entirely. Hoffmann watches through field glasses as Macedonian soldiers calmly fortify a position on a ridge that commands the only spring his division has left. He understands immediately what has just happened, with the same sinking recognition that has defined every stage of this campaign. His enemy has once again identified the one weakness that matters most and moved to exploit it before Hoffmann could react. The spring itself remains inside German control ground, technically, but the ridge above it now holds Macedonian archers and javelin throwers who can make any German soldier who approaches the water do so under fire. Water can still be reached. It simply now costs blood every time. Hoffmann calculates his remaining margin with the same cold precision his training demanded of him before any of this began. 600 men, existing water reserves in canteens and containers, perhaps 2 days at controlled rationing. After that, every trip to the spring becomes a combat operation. He convenes his remaining officers that night, by lamplight, in a command tent that increasingly feels like the interior of a tomb rather than a headquarters. Lieutenant Weber, the former history student who first identified their situation as time displacement, proposes the only option that does not end in slow starvation behind the lines Alexander has drawn around them. A night raid, not toward the spring, toward the Macedonian supply lines themselves, where Weber's observation of enemy patrol patterns suggests a weakness of their own. Weber has spent the week of siege doing what any good intelligence officer does with time and idle hands, watching the enemy as closely as the enemy has been watching them. He has noticed something Hoffmann's combat officers missed entirely, focused as they were on the immediate military threat. The Macedonian supply train, bringing food and water forward from a camp roughly 2 miles to the south, follows the same route every night, lightly guarded, because Alexander's forces have had no reason to expect the surrounded, fuel-starved Germans to project offensive power beyond their own collapsing perimeter. It is exactly the kind of overconfidence that has never once appeared in Alexander's own conduct of this campaign, and precisely because of that, none of his officers have considered that the Germans might attempt it. Hoffmann approves the raid with the specific caution of a man who understands he is spending his last reserve of surprise. 30 men, best remaining marksmen, moving on foot under cover of darkness through a gap in the encirclement that German reconnaissance has identified on the perimeter's southern edge. The one stretch of ground Macedonian patrols cover less frequently, screened by a dry riverbed that muffles sound and breaks sight lines. The raid moves out 2 hours after midnight on day 9. For the first 90 minutes, it works exactly as Weber predicted. The German soldiers cross open ground undetected, moving in the disciplined silence that Wehrmacht infantry training has drilled into them since basic instruction, reaching the supply route without triggering a single Macedonian patrol response. Then a dog barks. It is not a Macedonian soldier who ruins the raid. It is a single camp dog, brought along by a Persian auxiliary attached to the supply train, that catches an unfamiliar scent on the night wind and will not stop barking no matter how its handler tries to quiet it. The supply guard, 12 Macedonian soldiers who would ordinarily be dangerously outnumbered by 30 German raiders, do the one thing that changes the entire calculation. They do not investigate. They light a signal fire and fall back toward their own lines, exactly as Macedonian doctrine demands when a guard detachment suspects it faces a larger force than it can handle alone. Within minutes, the darkness that shielded the German raid becomes the enemy instead. Alexander's rapid reaction cavalry, the same companion cavalry that tested German firepower on the first day of contact, moves toward the signal fire faster than Hoffmann's raiding party can complete its mission and withdraw. Weber, leading the raid himself, realizes with growing horror that they have perhaps 4 minutes before mounted Macedonian soldiers arrive in numbers his 30 men cannot survive in open ground at night without a single vehicle to fall back to. What happens in the next 4 minutes will decide whether the German division has any future at all. Drop your prediction below. Part 3 is coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The 4 minutes Weber calculated become closer to 3. Macedonian companion cavalry crest the ridge above the supply route at a full gallop, moonlight catching on bronze cuirasses and lance points, and Weber understands with the flat clarity of man who has run out of options that his raiding party will not walk away from this night intact. He gives the only order that makes sense, not retreat. The open ground behind them offers no cover a running man could reach before cavalry closes the distance. Form a firing line. Concentrate every rifle and the single machine gun his men carried on the raid into a killing zone the horses will have to cross. It is in its own brutal way the first moment in this entire war where German firepower meets Macedonian cavalry on ground that favors neither side by terrain alone, just numbers, discipline, and the seconds before contact. The machine gun opens up at 200 meters. Horses go down in the first 3 seconds, and the momentum of a cavalry charge in the dark, disrupted by the leading riders falling, becomes chaos rather than a controlled wall of lances. But there are simply more Macedonians than German bullets, and the ones who make it through the initial burst arrive with spears and swords into a firing line that was never built to survive close combat with cavalry at all. Weber goes down in the first exchange, a lance wound to the shoulder that will not kill him, but ends his ability to command. Of the 30 men who left the German perimeter 2 hours after midnight, 11 make it back through the gap in the encirclement before dawn. Hoffmann receives the surviving raiders at first light and understands, without needing anyone to explain it to him, that the war is over. Not because of the casualties. 19 dead or captured is a number his division could have absorbed in any conventional engagement of the war he came from. It is over because the raid was the last card left to play, and it failed completely. Ammunition reserves, already thin after 8 days of siege, are now critically low. Water rationing has reached a point where soldiers are measuring individual mouthfuls. And somewhere beyond the Macedonian lines, mounted scouts are almost certainly reporting the raid's failure directly to Alexander himself, along with everything it revealed about German capabilities, tactics, and desperation. Hoffmann does the one thing his training never prepared him for, and his instincts increasingly insist is the only rational choice remaining. He orders a white flag raised over the German perimeter at midday. Alexander receives the request for parley in person, riding forward with the same cavalry escort he used for his first reconnaissance of the German position 11 days earlier. Through a Persian interpreter fluent enough in the crude hand signals and pointing that has passed for cross-temporal communication throughout this siege, Hoffman offers the only terms he believes Alexander might accept. Surrender of the division intact. In exchange, the lives of his 600 remaining men and safe passage to withdraw from Persian territory entirely. Alexander's answer, when it comes through the interpreter, is not what Hoffman expected. Alexander has no interest in 600 foreign soldiers withdrawing into territory he does not control, carrying weapons he does not yet understand, to some unknown fate beyond his reach. He offers different terms entirely, not withdrawal, but integration. The German soldiers will surrender their remaining weapons and ammunition. In exchange, they will be spared, fed, and settled as a distinct unit within his own army, their strange iron beasts studied by his engineers, their tactics absorbed by his own officers, their knowledge treated not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a resource too valuable to discard. Hoffman understands, listening to the terms translated back to him, that he is being offered something between captivity and adoption. It is not the surrender he imagined making. It is the only surrender available that does not end with his division destroyed to the last man in a siege that has already proven, over 11 days, exactly who holds every advantage that matters. He accepts. The formal surrender takes place at dusk. 600 German soldiers lay down rifles they have carried since a war 18 centuries in their own future, watched by Macedonian soldiers who have spent 11 days learning to fear and then outthink the strange machines now sitting silent and permanently empty across the valley floor. Alexander's engineers spend the following weeks examining the abandoned tanks with the same methodical curiosity that has defined every stage of his response to this impossible war. They cannot replicate the engines. They cannot manufacture the fuel. But the guns, rifles, machine guns, the basic mechanical principles of cartridge ammunition, those Macedonian craftsmen begin to understand within months. History, the version that continues forward from this moment, will never fully record what happened to the 600 men of a German division that vanished from the Eastern Front in 1941 and never returned. Berlin will list them as missing, presumed lost to Soviet encirclement, in a war that continues without them exactly as it did in every version of history that does not include this impossible detour through ancient Persia. For Alexander, the encounter leaves something more lasting than 600 integrated soldiers and a handful of tanks that will eventually rust into curiosities his descendants will not know how to explain. It leaves a lesson he carries into every campaign that follows for the rest of his life, that the deciding factor in any war, ancient or impossibly future, is never simply the sophistication of the weapon. It is supply, patience, terrain, and the willingness to win slowly rather than lose quickly. Weber survives his wound. He spends the remaining decades of his unexpected life as an advisor to Macedonian military engineers, an old man by the time of Alexander's death, still unable to fully explain to anyone around him how he came to be teaching ancient soldiers principles of warfare that, in the world he came from, would not be formalized for another 2,000 years. The tanks themselves are eventually broken down for their metal, their true origin fading into a court legend about iron beasts that fell from a tear in the sky, a story that outlives every soldier who was actually there to see it happen, on both sides of a war that history was never supposed to record at all. What do you think? Did Alexander make the right call? Or should he have destroyed the Germans entirely? Drop your thoughts below. Thanks for watching the full series. More alternate history is coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it.